My family didn't invite me for a fancy dinner, but expected me to act like their personal maid. I wasn't even invited to the dinner, but they still expected me to show up, set the table, and clean up. Sounds insane, right? But this wasn't just one night. This was my entire life being the family's background crew, always expected but never appreciated. Until one night, I decided enough was enough. What happened next? Let's just say they never saw it coming. Stick around, because by the end of this story, you'll question everything you thought about family obligations. The phone buzzed in my hand, and when I glanced at the screen, my mother's name flashed across it. I hesitated before answering, already bracing myself for whatever demand was coming this time. I took a deep breath and pressed the phone to my ear. "Hey, Mom, you'll come early on Friday to set the table, right?" Diane's voice was brisk, direct, leaving no room for negotiation. I frowned, shifting the phone closer. "Wait, what's happening Friday?" There was a pause just long enough for me to sense the disapproval forming on the other end. Then a sigh. The kind that carried years of silent expectations. Kevin's promotion dinner, of course. "You wouldn't have forgotten, would you?" I hadn't forgotten. How could I? It had been the topic of every family conversation for weeks. The only difference was that I hadn't been invited. "I wasn't aware there was a dinner," I said, keeping my voice even. Another pause. Then, Diane's tone shifted to something almost dismissive. "Well, it's mostly for Kevin's colleagues, and some important guests. You wouldn't really fit in." The words landed like a slap. Not that I was surprised. It was always Kevin, the golden child, the one they celebrated, the one who got the attention, while I was expected to make things run smoothly in the background. But this time, something inside me twisted. "But you still want me to come and set the table," I said, my grip tightening around the phone. "Exactly," Diane chirped, as if I had just solved a simple puzzle. "You've always been so good at these things, honey. Don't worry about staying long, just help with the setup. Make sure everything looks perfect, and we'll handle it from there." I clenched my jaw, forcing myself to stay calm. This wasn't new. I had spent years being the reliable extra, the one who handled the details while Kevin basked in the spotlight. It had always been Kevin's achievements, Kevin's milestones, Kevin's success. I had told myself it didn't bother me. But tonight, as my mother spoke so casually, as if it was obvious that I wasn't worth inviting, something inside me shifted. "That's fine," I finally said, my voice deceptively calm. "Oh, good," Diane said, completely unaware of the storm brewing inside me. 4 o'clock sharp. "Oh, and could you pick up some extra napkins? We might run out." "Sure," I forced out, knowing she wouldn't even register the tightness in my tone. "Thanks, sweetheart. You're a lifesaver," Diane added before hanging up, not even waiting for me to say goodbye. I set the phone down and stared out of my apartment window, a dull ache settling in my chest. I had moved out years ago to escape this, to carve out a life where I wasn't just the family's background crew. And yet, no amount of distance seemed to matter. They still expected me to drop everything for them. They still assumed I would. My phone buzzed again. A notification from an old reservation app I hadn't used in months. A table for one at my favorite restaurant. Friday night. My finger hovered over the screen. It would be so easy, so natural to push my own plans aside. But this time, something was different. This time, I hesitated for only a moment before I tapped reserve. Let them figure it out. By Thursday afternoon, my phone was buzzing non-stop. "Don't forget to pick up the extra napkins. Kevin's boss is bringing his wife. Make sure the table settings are perfect." Each message made my frustration curl tighter inside me. They hadn't even asked if I wanted to help. They had just assumed, like always. I sat on my couch, staring at the confirmation email from my reservation. Guilt tugged at me for a moment. Was it wrong to leave them hanging when they clearly needed me? But then I thought of all the times I had dropped everything for them, only to be dismissed, ignored, excluded. This wasn't about just Friday night. This was about years of being overlooked. No. This time they could figure it out on their own. "Friday morning," Diane called. Just a quick reminder to be here by 4, she said cheerfully. We're counting on you. I hesitated, then said, Don't worry, Mom. I'll take care of it. Oh, good, Diane sighed in relief. You always know how to make things perfect. I don't know what we'd do without you. Yeah, I murmured. I know. The day passed in a strange haze of nerves and quiet excitement. For the first time in years, I wasn't preparing for them. I was preparing for myself. I put on my favorite dress, did my makeup, and grabbed my purse. When I locked my apartment door behind me, a weight I hadn't realized I'd been carrying seemed to lift. I wasn't rushing to meet their expectations. I was choosing myself. By 7:30, I was seated at a candlelit table, a glass of wine in hand, the hum of quiet conversation surrounding me. I felt free. Let them figure it out. Back at my parents' house, I could only imagine the chaos. Diane pacing the kitchen, confusion shifting to panic as the minutes ticked by. Kevin scrolling on his phone, assuming I'd show up any second. Paul, my father, making excuses. She's probably running late. And then the realization would set in. I wasn't coming. My phone buzzed, but I ignored it. I already knew what the messages would say. Where are you? The guests will be here any minute. Why aren't you answering? I almost felt sorry for them. Almost. When the waiter returned, I ordered a dish I had always wanted to try but had never given myself the excuse to. When the meal arrived, beautifully plated, rich aromas filling the air, I smiled. This was what freedom felt like, choosing what I wanted, when I wanted, without anyone else's expectations weighing me down. The first message came in at 4:05 p.m. Where are you? Then another at 4:15. Mira, the guests will be here soon. You were supposed to be here already. I could picture my mother pacing around the kitchen, her phone clutched tightly in her hand, her irritation growing with each passing second. I imagined her glancing at the half-set table, at the candles still unlit, at Kevin, who was probably sitting there doing nothing, and at my father, who was likely offering some half-hearted reassurance. I could see the frustration flicker across her face as the realization sank in. I wasn't coming. I took another slow sip of wine, feeling the warmth settle in my chest, the weight of years of expectations lifting with every second that passed. Let them figure it out. By 4:30, my phone was vibrating non-stop. My mother, my father, even Kevin. Now that's interesting. Kevin never called me unless he needed something. I let it ring, staring at his name flashing across the screen, before silencing it completely. It was almost funny how quickly they had gone from assuming I would be there to panicking when I wasn't. I scrolled through my emails, checking the reservation confirmation again as if I needed reassurance that I had actually followed through with this decision. A table for one. My name neatly printed at the top. It felt almost surreal. The waiter returned, refilling my glass. Waiting on someone? He asked politely. I smiled. No, just me tonight. He nodded as if he understood something I didn't, then left me to enjoy the quiet hum of the restaurant. Back at my parents' house, I imagined the tension boiling over. My mother would be snapping at my father, demanding he call me, demanding an explanation. Kevin, as useless as ever, would be scrolling through his phone, shaking his head. Told you she was flaky, he'd probably mutter. Flaky, that word had followed me for years. Not because I was unreliable, but because I never said no. And the one time I did, suddenly I was the problem. At 5:00 p.m., my phone finally stopped buzzing. The silence felt more victorious than I expected. They had given up, or so I thought. At 6:30, just as I was finishing my meal, a text from my father appeared. Mira, we need to talk. Short, simple. But I knew exactly what it meant. I debated ignoring it. I debated finishing my dessert, walking out of the restaurant, and pretending none of this was happening. But something inside me, curiosity, maybe made me tap on his name and call back. He answered immediately. Mira. I could hear the noise in the background, glasses clinking, muffled conversations, the hum of an evening that should have been going smoothly, but clearly wasn't. "Dad," I said, my voice steady. "Your mother is losing her mind," he sighed. I smirked. Figured. He hesitated. "She didn't think you'd actually not show up." "Yeah, well," I said, swirling the last sip of wine in my glass. "She didn't think to invite me either." A pause. Then, softer, I know. That caught me off guard. "She shouldn't have assumed," he admitted. "None of us should have." I leaned back in my chair. "And yet, you all did." "Mira," he started, but I cut him off. "Dad, be honest. If I had shown up, would anyone have even noticed me beyond what I could do for them? Beyond the fact that I made sure the table was perfect, the food was served on time, that everything looked exactly the way Mom wanted?" Another pause. "I would have noticed," he said quietly. That stung more than I expected. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Finally, he sighed again. "Look, I'm not going to beg you to come back, but you shook things up tonight." "Good," I said, surprising myself with how firm my voice was. Dad let out a short, almost amused chuckle. "Yeah, good." I could hear my mother's voice in the background, sharp, impatient. "Is she coming?" Dad exhaled heavily. "Mira, I need to go." I smiled. "Tell Mom I said good luck." He didn't answer, just a low chuckle before he hung up. I sat there for a few moments, letting the weight of the conversation settle in. I had done it. I had said no. I had watched them scramble, watched them realize, maybe for the first time, that I wasn't just going to be there whenever they needed me. And the best part? I didn't feel guilty. I signaled for the check, feeling lighter than I had in years. Back at the house, I imagined my mother finally sitting down at the table, her frustration still simmering, the dinner slightly less perfect than she had envisioned. And Kevin, smug as ever, probably assuming that eventually I'd fall back in line. But he was wrong, because this wasn't just about one dinner. This was about all the dinners, all the birthdays, all the holidays, all the moments where I had been expected to be there, to handle things, to make their lives easier while they barely acknowledged mine. This was about drawing a line. And for the first time in my life, I was standing firmly on the other side of it. So there I was, expected to drop everything and serve a dinner I wasn't even invited to. But this time, something inside me snapped. What would you do? Would you show up and play your part? Or would you finally say no? Comment 1 if you think I gave in, or 2 if you think I walked away for good. Let's see who guesses right. I woke up the next morning feeling strangely light, as if some invisible weight had finally been lifted off my shoulders. The sun filtered through my bedroom window, casting a soft glow across my sheets, and for the first time in years, I didn't wake up with a mental checklist of things to do for my family. No frantic texts from my mother demanding I pick up last-minute items. No guilt-tripping calls reminding me to show up early and help out. Just silence. And it was beautiful. I stretched lazily, savoring the moment before finally reaching for my phone. The first thing I saw was a text from my father, sent late last night. "We need to talk." That was it. No accusations. No guilt. Just a simple request. I let out a slow breath and placed the phone back on my nightstand without responding. I already knew how that conversation would go. My father would be calm, diplomatic, trying to smooth things over, while my mother fumed in the background, still convinced I had committed some kind of betrayal. And Kevin would probably be the same smug, self-important version of himself, barely acknowledging that anything was different. I swung my legs over the edge of the bed and padded into the kitchen, flipping on the coffee maker. As the rich aroma filled the air, I glanced at my schedule for the day, something I had started keeping ever since I moved out of my parents' house. It wasn't packed with obligations to them. No errands, no setting tables, no quick favors that somehow took up my entire evening. Instead, I had a meeting at work, a workout planned, and dinner with a friend later. My life, my time, and it felt good. As I sipped my coffee, my phone buzzed again. This time, It was my mother. I didn't even have to open the message to know what it said. I let it sit there, unread. Another buzz, then another. I sighed, finally giving in, curiosity getting the better of me. Mira, I don't know what kind of statement you were trying to make last night, but I hope it was worth it. You embarrassed me. The dinner was a disaster without you. I let out a short laugh. A disaster? The worst thing that happened was that she had to set her own table and serve food that was probably already catered. The house didn't burn down. The guests didn't leave in outrage. But to her, my absence was the catastrophe. Another message popped up. I just don't understand why you would do this to your own family. Ah, there it was. The emotional manipulation. The framing of my decision as an attack, as if my entire purpose in life was to make sure my family functioned smoothly. As if my choosing to value myself, just this once, was some kind of personal betrayal. I didn't reply. Not because I didn't have anything to say, but because I knew it wouldn't matter. My mother wasn't looking for an explanation, she was looking for a way to make me feel guilty enough to fall back in line. Instead, I set my phone down, grabbed my keys, and left for work. Hours passed, and I kept expecting the calls to stop, the messages to slow down, but they didn't. At one point, even Kevin tried to call me. That was unexpected. I stared at my phone, debating whether or not to pick up. Against my better judgment, I answered. What? Wow, he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. Nice to hear from you too. I exhaled. What do you want, Kevin? Oh, I don't know, he mused. Maybe an explanation for why you decided to throw a tantrum and leave us hanging last night? I scoffed. A tantrum? Are you serious? He let out a humorless laugh. Yeah, Mira, I am. Mom was freaking out. Dad had to step in and basically do everything, and I had to listen to them argue about you the whole night. I smirked. So what you're telling me is, you had to sit there and watch while someone else handled the mess for once? Must have been rough, he sighed heavily. Look, I get that you're pissed or whatever, but this was low even for you. I bristled. Low? Yeah, he continued. I mean, what were you even trying to prove? That you don't need us? That you're better than us? I clenched my jaw, gripping the steering wheel as I pulled into my apartment complex. No, Kevin. I was proving that I'm done being treated like the family's unpaid help, that I don't exist just to make your life easier. He was silent for a moment, and I could practically hear the gears turning in his head. Finally, he let out another sigh. Whatever, Mira. I just hope you're happy. I laughed. For the first time in years? Yeah, I actually am. I ended the call before he could say anything else. The rest of the day was quieter. No calls from my father. No texts from my mother. I didn't know whether they had finally given up or if they were planning their next move, but for once, I didn't care. That night, I went out to dinner with a friend, and for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel like I had to check my phone every few minutes. I wasn't bracing myself for another demand, another expectation. I was present, and it felt good. But as I walked back into my apartment, my phone buzzed again. This time, a voicemail from my dad. I hesitated, then pressed play. Mira, his voice came through, quieter than usual. I know you don't want to talk, but just hear me out. Your mother is upset, more than usual. And I think it's because she finally realized something we should have realized a long time ago. We've been unfair to you. And we're sorry. I sucked in a breath, my chest tightening. I don't expect you to respond right away, he continued. I just want you to know that, for what it's worth, we see you now. The message ended, and I stood there for a long moment, staring at my phone. For years, I had been screaming into a void, trying to get them to see me, to hear me, to acknowledge me as more than just a convenience. And now, suddenly, they did. But the real question was, did it even matter anymore? I sat on my couch, staring at my phone, my father's voice still echoing in my mind. We see you now. The words should have meant something, should have given me a sense of satisfaction, but instead, they left me feeling hollow. After all these years, after countless times of being overlooked, taken for granted, and treated like a second-class family member, now they wanted to acknowledge me. Now, when it was convenient for them, a part of me wanted to believe it, to hold on to the hope that maybe, just maybe, things had changed. But another part of me, the part that had spent years being the family's uncredited backbone, knew better. I exhaled, setting my phone down on the coffee table, resisting the urge to respond. Let them sit with it. Let them feel what it's like to be ignored, to have their words left hanging in the air with no reassurance. No immediate answer. It was a small rebellion, but it was mine. The next morning, I woke up to another text from my father. I hope you'll call soon. Mom wants to talk. I scoffed, rolling my eyes. Of course she did. I could already picture her pacing in the kitchen, arms crossed, frustration bubbling just beneath the surface. My mother was never good at being on the receiving end of silence. She expected immediate compliance, instant answers, people bending to her will without hesitation. And when they didn't? Well, let's just say she had a way of making them feel like the villain. I let out a slow breath, shaking my head as I got out of bed and made my way to the kitchen. Coffee first, emotional warfare later. As the machine hummed, filling the air with the familiar scent of dark roast, I glanced at my calendar. Another reminder of how much my life had changed since leaving their house. My days were filled with things I chose, work projects I actually enjoyed, hobbies I'd rediscovered, nights spent with friends who didn't see me as a resource to be exploited. I had built something outside of them. And yet, here I was, still feeling the pull of their expectations. By lunchtime, the silence was over. My phone buzzed with an incoming call. Not from my father this time. My mother. I stared at the screen, debating. Answering would mean giving her an opening, an opportunity to guilt me, to twist the situation until I was the problem. Ignoring her would only make it worse. She would find another way to reach me, another way to push herself into my space. With a sigh, I answered. Hello? Mira, she said, her tone clipped, controlled. So, are we done with this little game now? I closed my eyes for a moment, already regretting picking up. Game? She huffed. Whatever point you were trying to make by not showing up, I think we've all gotten it loud and clear. I laughed dryly, shaking my head. Have you? Because from where I'm sitting, it sounds like you still don't get it. Silence. Then Mira, come on. You made your statement. You upset the entire evening. Do you feel better now? There it was. The shift. The slow, insidious attempt to turn this into my fault. I leaned against the counter, gripping the phone a little tighter. What I feel, Mom, is relief. For once, I didn't spend my night running around, making everything perfect for people who don't even think to include me in the event itself. I spent my night how I wanted, and it felt amazing. A beat of silence. Then a quiet sigh. You know, I thought you were more mature than this. I closed my eyes, counting to 3. Right. Because choosing myself for once is childish, but expecting me to be the family's personal event planner without so much as an invitation is perfectly reasonable. That's not what I meant, she snapped. But it's what you said, I shot back. Another silence. I could practically hear her grinding her teeth on the other end. Then, softer this time, I just don't understand why you had to make a scene. I let out a slow breath. I didn't make a scene, Mom. I just didn't show up. To your family's dinner, she emphasized. To Kevin's dinner, I corrected. And you made it very clear I wasn't important enough to be there except when it came to setting the table and making sure everything was flawless. She inhaled sharply, but for the first time, she didn't have an immediate comeback. Do you even hear yourself? I continued, pressing forward before she could regain control of the conversation. Do you realize how insulting it is to be treated like an afterthought? To be expected to work behind the scenes while everyone else gets to sit down and enjoy themselves? Her voice wavered slightly. That's not how I see you. But it's how you treat me, I said, my tone softer now. Not because I was backing down, but because I was exhausted. So exhausted. A long pause. Then, finally, I suppose. I didn't think about it that way. I blinked. That was the closest thing to an admission of guilt I had ever heard from my mother. Another silence stretched between us, heavier than before. Mom, I said carefully, if you ever want me to be part of these things, you need to start treating me like I belong there. Not as an accessory. Not as free labor. As a guest. As your daughter. Another pause. Then, a slow exhale. I don't know if I can change overnight. I let out a breath of my own. I'm not asking you to. I'm asking you to try. Silence. Then, a quiet, almost hesitant. Okay. I nodded to myself. It wasn't everything. But maybe, just maybe, it was a start. I sat at my desk, fingers drumming against the wood, my phone lying face up beside me. My mother's hesitant okay still echoed in my mind, but I wasn't naive enough to believe it was over. Diane never gave in that easily. She may have admitted, however reluctantly, that she needed to change, but that didn't mean she would. The next test would come soon. I could feel it. It wasn't a question of if she would revert to her old ways, it was when. The tension coiled in my stomach like a tight spring, anticipation laced with a familiar dread. For years, I had been trained to expect disappointment, to brace myself for the inevitable moment when their words wouldn't match their actions. But this time, I wasn't going to let it blindside me. This time, I was prepared. I reached for my coffee, taking a slow sip, letting the warmth spread through me. My mornings used to be filled with obligations, text messages from my mom, last-minute errands, frantic preparations for events I hadn't even been invited to. But today, my phone was silent. No orders, no assumptions, no guilt-tripping disguised as motherly concern, just peace. And it felt unnatural. Then, just as I was beginning to think I might actually get a reprieve, my phone buzzed. I didn't even have to check the screen. I already knew who it was. With a sigh, I picked it up and saw exactly what I expected, another text from Diane. Your father and I are hosting a small dinner on Sunday. No pressure, but we'd love to have you there. I stared at the message, a frown tugging at my lips. No pressure? That was new. The old Diane would have demanded my presence, not asked for it. She would have sent a list of things for me to pick up on the way. She would have given me a role, an expectation, a task. But this? This was different. I reread the message 3 times before responding. I'll think about it. A minute passed. Then another. My fingers hovered over my phone, waiting for the inevitable follow-up. The why wouldn't you come? The Kevin will be there. The you know how much this means to us. But nothing came. Just silence. I set my phone down, exhaling. Was this real? Or just another carefully calculated move to make me think they were changing? The next few days passed without incident. No extra texts, no surprise guilt trips. But the feeling of waiting for the other shoe to drop never left me. It sat with me while I worked, while I went out with friends, while I curled up on my couch at night. I knew my family too well. Change didn't happen overnight. By Sunday afternoon, I still hadn't decided if I was going. I could feel the weight of the decision pressing on me, the familiar tug of war between standing my ground and giving in just enough to keep the peace. But wasn't this what I had wanted? For them to respect my choice? To invite me as a guest instead of a worker? And yet, something still didn't feel right. At 4:00 p.m., around the time my mother had likely started setting the table, I found myself pacing my apartment. My thoughts looped in circles. If I went, would it be an admission that I was slipping back into old habits? If I didn't, would they use it as an excuse to claim I was the problem all along? Then, at 4:30, my phone buzzed again. This time, it wasn't from my mother. Kevin. So, are you coming, or are you still making a point? I clenched my jaw, irritation sparking through me. Still making a point? As if this entire situation was just a tantrum, a petty rebellion. As if I hadn't spent years being overlooked, taken advantage of, and expected to clean up after his accomplishments. My fingers moved before I could second-guess myself. I haven't decided yet. But it's cute that you think my boundaries are just about making a point. His reply was immediate. Oh, come on. Mom's actually trying. Don't be a brat about it. I let out a sharp laugh, shaking my head. There it was. The guilt. The dismissal. The implication that my entire life of being treated like an afterthought was just some minor misunderstanding. I typed back, my hands steady. You're right. Mom is trying. And for once, I'm going to let her. That means she gets to prove she meant what she said without me rushing in to fix everything. If she really wants me there, she'll be fine whether I show up or not. I hit send and tossed my phone onto the couch, my heart pounding. Minutes passed, no response. Good. Let him sit with that. I grabbed my jacket and keys, heading out the door. Not to my parents' house. Not to the dinner where I was expected to prove I was still the good daughter. No, I had my own plans tonight. Plans that had nothing to do with them. As I stepped outside, I felt that small but undeniable shift. I wasn't the same person I had been a year ago. Hell, I wasn't the same person I had been a month ago. And no amount of carefully worded invitations or half-hearted apologies could change that. If my family truly wanted me to be part of their lives, they'd have to accept me on my terms. And for the first time, I wasn't afraid to make them wait. I sat on my couch, staring at my phone, the screen dimming after Kevin's last message. It had been over an hour, and still nothing. No follow-up, no passive-aggressive remark, no last-ditch attempt to make me feel guilty. That alone told me everything I needed to know. He was pissed, but more than that, he was waiting. Waiting for me to cave. Waiting for me to do what I had always done, second-guess myself, let the weight of their disappointment sink in, and eventually show up just to keep the peace. But this time, I didn't feel guilty. I felt something else. Something unfamiliar, something I had only tasted in small doses before now. I felt free. I leaned back against the couch, letting out a slow breath. The silence in my apartment stretched around me, heavy but not suffocating. It was strange. I had spent so much of my life running to meet their demands, fixing their problems, making sure everything was perfect. And now, for the first time, I wasn't rushing anywhere. I wasn't being expected. I wasn't needed. And despite everything, despite the years of conditioning that told me I should feel guilty, I didn't. I felt lighter. Then, just as I was beginning to believe I had finally earned a moment of peace, my phone buzzed again. Not a text this time, a call, Diane. I let it ring, once, twice, 3 times. My pulse ticked up, my fingers twitching slightly against my leg. She never called when she knew I was ignoring her texts. Not unless she was desperate. I hesitated, then swiped to answer. Mom. Mira, she said, her voice tight, clipped. What's going on? I closed my eyes for a moment, already exhausted. What do you mean? You know exactly what I mean. A sharp inhale. You're not here. I let out a short laugh, shaking my head. You invited me as a guest, remember? Guests aren't required to come. A pause. Then, a forced chuckle, the kind that barely masked her irritation. Oh, honey, let's not do this. It's just dinner. Just dinner. Right. Just like all the other dinners where I was expected to work behind the scenes while Kevin sat back and enjoyed himself. Just like all the times they assumed I would drop everything for them. Without hesitation, without question. I already made plans, I said simply, staring at the ceiling. Like I told Kevin, if you actually wanted me there, you'd be fine whether I showed up or not. Her tone shifted, the forced lightness disappearing. That's not fair, isn't it? I countered. You didn't ask me to come, Mom. You expected me to. Just like you always do. I asked this time. She shot back. I told you it was your choice. And I chose, I said, my patience thinning. And now you're calling me, acting like I made the wrong one. Silence. I could almost hear her gritting her teeth. Then, in a quieter voice, she said, "Mira, we're family." I clenched my jaw, my grip tightening around my phone. "Yeah, we are. But tell me something, Mom. When was the last time you invited me to something where I wasn't expected to do something for you? When was the last time I was just included? Not because I was useful. Not because you needed me to set the table, or make everything look perfect, or play peacekeeper when Kevin acted like a spoiled brat. When was the last time you actually wanted me there?" She didn't answer. I swallowed, my chest tightening. You don't get to suddenly pretend this is about family. Not after years of making me feel like an outsider. Not after everything. More silence. Then, softer. "I didn't realize you felt that way." I laughed, but there was no humor in it. "That's because you never listened." Another pause. Then, a sigh. "Mira, I'm not trying to fight with you." "Then what are you trying to do?" I pressed. "Because right now, it sounds a lot like you're just upset that I finally said no." She hesitated. "That's not—" She cut herself off, exhaling. I wanted tonight to be different." I let out a slow breath, my anger cooling just slightly. "So did I." Another pause. Then, softer. "So what happens now?" I swallowed, my throat tight. "That's up to you." I didn't expect an answer. Not right away. Diane had spent years justifying her actions, convincing herself that she wasn't really treating me differently, that I was just more responsible, that I liked being the one who held everything together. Tonight was the first time she was being forced to sit with the reality of her choices. And I wasn't going to give her an easy way out. For once, she was the one who had to figure it out. I glanced at my phone, waiting for the inevitable fine, "Suit yourself," before she hung up. But instead, she did something I hadn't expected. She sighed, long and heavy. "I'll let you go." I blinked. "That's it?" A dry laugh. "I think I need to think about things." I exhaled, tension I hadn't realized I was holding slowly unraveling. "Okay." A beat of silence. Then, quietly, "Good night, Mira." I hesitated. "Good night, Mom." I hung up, staring at the screen for a long moment before setting my phone down. My heart was still pounding, adrenaline still running high. But for the first time, it didn't feel like I had lost a fight. It felt like I had finally won. I sat on my couch, gripping my phone tightly, my mind still processing the conversation with Diane. She had actually stopped pushing. She had let me go. That alone was a shift I hadn't expected. But if there was one thing I knew about my family, it was that change didn't happen overnight. I wasn't naive enough to think this was the end of it. No, this was just the calm before the storm. And I was right. The next morning, my phone buzzed again. I had ignored most of their messages since last night, but something about this one made my stomach tighten. It was from Kevin. "Mom's a wreck. Hope you're happy," I scoffed, rolling my eyes. Of course, he was making this about me. I started typing a response, but before I could finish, another message popped up. "You should at least call her. This whole thing is stupid." I clenched my jaw. This whole thing, as if years of being overlooked, used, and dismissed was just some petty argument I had blown out of proportion. He still didn't get it. He never would. Kevin had never once been expected to serve this family the way I had. He had never been asked to clean up after everyone, to take care of the details, to make sure things ran smoothly, while being treated like an afterthought. And yet, now that I had finally put my foot down, I was the problem. I deleted my half-typed message and tossed my phone onto the coffee table. I wasn't going to play this game. Not this time. I spent the rest of the morning focusing on myself, something I wasn't used to doing. I went for a long walk, grabbed a coffee from a place I loved but rarely had time to visit, and let myself enjoy the quiet. No expectations, no obligations. Just me. But even as I tried to relax, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming. And I was right. By mid-afternoon, my phone rang. This time, it was my dad. I hesitated before answering, already bracing myself. "Hey, Dad." There was a pause. Then, "Hey, sweetheart." His voice was calm, careful, like he was trying to avoid setting off a bomb. I just wanted to check in, I exhaled, rubbing my temple. Check in? Or convince me to apologize to Mom? He let out a quiet chuckle, but there was no humor in it. I think you and I both know that wouldn't work. I didn't respond. I talked to your mother this morning, he continued. She's upset, but I think she's starting to understand. At least, I hope she is. I leaned against the counter, my fingers tapping against the cool surface. She said that? She didn't say much of anything, really, he admitted, but she's been quiet. That's not normal. I let out a short laugh. No, it's not. Another pause. Then, softer, Mira, I know we've made a lot of mistakes. I know your mother has, and I know I've let it happen. His voice wavered slightly. I guess I never thought you'd actually walk away. I swallowed hard, something tightening in my chest. I didn't walk away, Dad. I just stopped showing up where I wasn't wanted. You were always wanted, sweetheart, he said, his tone heavy. We just didn't know how to show it. I blinked, caught off guard by the unexpected honesty. My dad had never been the type to say things like this to admit fault, to acknowledge the ways things had been unfair. But now, here he was, laying it out in the open. And I didn't know what to do with that. He sighed. I don't want this to be the end of things. I bit my lip, thinking, that depends. On what? On whether anything actually changes, I said simply. Because I can't keep doing this, Dad. I can't keep being the one who's only valued when I'm useful. I can't keep pretending like it doesn't bother me when you and Mom treat Kevin like the golden child while I'm expected to play support. Silence. Then, after a long pause, he said, You're right. I blinked. What? You're right, he repeated, his voice steady. I don't know if I ever really saw it before. Or maybe I did, and I just ignored it because it was easier, but I hear you now. I let out a shaky breath, my emotions swirling into something complicated. I don't know what to do with that. You don't have to do anything, he said. Just give us a chance to fix it. I swallowed, my throat tight. We'll see. That's all I can ask for, he said quietly. Take your time, sweetheart. Just don't shut us out completely. I nodded, even though he couldn't see me. I won't. There was a beat of silence. Then, I love you, kid. I squeezed my eyes shut, forcing back the emotions threatening to rise. I love you too, Dad. We hung up, and I sat there for a long time, staring at my phone, trying to process everything. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. But for the first time, I felt like maybe there was a chance things could be different, but only if they proved it. I sat in my car outside my apartment, gripping the steering wheel, my dad's words still playing in my head. Take your time, sweetheart. Just don't shut us out completely. It was the first time he'd ever admitted that things hadn't been fair, that maybe they had taken me for granted. And yet, part of me couldn't trust it. Was this genuine, or was it just another way to lure me back in? My whole life had been a cycle of them expecting, me complying, and them never thinking twice about what I actually wanted. One conversation wasn't going to erase years of that. I let out a slow breath, trying to shake the weight off my chest. But before I could even process my next move, my phone buzzed again. Mom. I clenched my jaw. I should have known this was coming. For a moment, I debated ignoring it, letting her calls go to voicemail just like I had with Kevin's texts. But something in me wanted to hear it. It wanted to know exactly how she was going to spin this. Was she going to apologize, demand an explanation, pretend like nothing happened? Whatever it was, I needed to hear it for myself. I swiped to answer. Hello? Mira? Her voice was tight, controlled, not angry yet but teetering on the edge. I've been trying to reach you. I know, I said flatly. A beat of silence. Then, I just don't understand, I scoffed. What don't you understand, Mom? That I didn't drop everything to cater to a dinner I wasn't even invited to? You always help, she said, her tone clipped. You always show up, and then suddenly, out of nowhere, you just don't? I felt my pulse quicken, heat rising in my chest. You're acting like I did something to you, like I betrayed you. But I didn't. I just didn't play along this time. Another pause, then a sharp exhale. You embarrassed me, Mira. I almost laughed. Embarrassed you? Yes, she snapped. Do you know how I looked when people arrived and the table wasn't set? When the appetizers weren't plated? When things weren't perfect the way they always are? I gripped the phone tighter. You mean the way I always make them? She hesitated. That hesitation was everything. I let out a cold chuckle. That's what this is really about, isn't it? It's not that I wasn't there. It's that I didn't make you look good. That's not. It is. I cut her off. You didn't care if I was at the dinner, Mom. You just cared that I was there to set everything up so you could take credit for it. You wanted the polished version of yourself to present to your guests. And when I wasn't there to make that happen, it all fell apart. She let out a slow, frustrated breath. That's not fair. I shook my head, even though she couldn't see me. Fair? Do you want to talk about what's fair? Because it wasn't fair that Kevin got to sit at the table while I was setting it. It wasn't fair that I was expected to clean up after events I wasn't even included in. It wasn't fair that I was never invited, just expected. My voice wavered, but I held my ground. So forgive me if I don't care that you were embarrassed for one night, when I've spent years being treated like the family's unpaid event planner. The silence on the other end stretched long and thin. When she finally spoke again, her voice was quieter. I didn't realize you felt that way. I exhaled sharply, my grip loosening just a little. Because you never asked. Another pause. Then, in an almost reluctant tone, she said, I suppose I should have. I leaned back in my seat, staring at the ceiling. Yeah, you should have. She sighed, and for the first time, she sounded tired, really tired. Not in the exasperated, dramatic way she usually was when things didn't go her way, but in a way that told me something had shifted. I won't say I understand everything, Mira, but I do see now that maybe we've taken you for granted. My stomach twisted, emotions tangling inside me. I wanted to believe her. I wanted to think that this was real, that it meant something. But after years of being dismissed, could I trust that she really saw it now? Your father told me he spoke to you, she added, and that you're not shutting us out. That means something, right? I swallowed hard. I don't know what it means yet. She was quiet for a moment. Then, softer than I'd ever heard her, she said, I'd like to invite you to dinner. As a guest. No expectations. No setting up. No cleaning. Just come if you want to. I blinked. My mother had never invited me to anything without an expectation attached. This was the first time she had actually asked me to come, instead of assuming I would be there. And yet, a part of me still hesitated. I'll think about it. That's all I can ask, she said. And for the first time, I believed her. I hung up, staring at my phone, my heart pounding in my chest. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. But for the first time in my life, I felt like the dynamic had shifted, like I had taken back control. They weren't demanding, they weren't guilting me, they weren't pulling me back in with manipulation. They were asking, and for now, that was enough. I sat in my car outside my parents' house, gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. The warm glow of the porch light cast long shadows against the driveway, making everything feel eerily familiar yet entirely different. I had been here 1,000 times before, pulled by obligation, guilt, or the quiet, unspoken expectation that I would always show up. But tonight, something had changed. I had changed. And for the first time, I was stepping into that house as something more than just the family's invisible support system. I was stepping in as me, a guest, someone with a choice. I took a deep breath, steadying myself before finally pushing open the car door. The cool evening air brushed against my skin, grounding me as I walked up the front steps. I hesitated only for a second before ringing the doorbell. It felt strange, foreign even. I had never needed to ring the bell before. I had always just walked in, like a member of the staff expected to be there before the real event began. But tonight, I waited. A few seconds later, the door opened, and there was my father. He looked at me, really looked at me, and for once, there was no expectation in his eyes. No underlying assumption that I had come to fix everything, just relief. "Mira," he said, his voice softer than I had expected. "I'm glad you're here." I gave a small nod, stepping inside. The familiar scent of roasted chicken and warm spices filled the air, a stark contrast to the usual frantic energy that used to buzz through the house before an event. The dining table was already set imperfectly, but set. The silverware wasn't arranged in its usual perfect symmetry, and the candles looked like they had been placed at random, but it was clear someone had done it, and it hadn't been me. Diane appeared from the kitchen, wiping her hands on a dish towel. Her eyes met mine, and for the first time in my life, she looked almost uncertain. "You made it," she said, her voice careful, almost cautious. I nodded. "I did." There was an awkward pause before she stepped aside, gesturing toward the dining room. "Dinner's almost ready. You can sit wherever you like." The words shouldn't have meant so much, but they did. Because for once there was no Mira, "Can you fix this?" or "Make sure everything looks perfect." Just a choice. I took a seat at the table, noticing Kevin already there, scrolling on his phone. He glanced up at me, giving a slight nod. Hey, I replied, taking my place at the opposite end of the table. A few minutes later, my parents brought out the food. It wasn't the picture-perfect presentation Diane usually insisted on. The salad looked like it had been thrown together last minute. The serving bowls didn't match, and one of the dishes had a small chip in the rim. But none of that mattered. For the first time, I wasn't the one making sure every detail was flawless. And that, in itself, was freeing. Conversation started slow, cautious, as if everyone was afraid to acknowledge the shift in dynamics. But eventually, something eased. My dad asked about my job. My mom talked about a book club she was thinking of joining. And even Kevin, for once, refrained from making any smug remarks. There was an unfamiliar ease in the air, one I had never experienced before at this table. Halfway through the meal, Diane cleared her throat. "Mira," she said hesitantly, setting down her fork, "I just wanted to say, I know things haven't always been fair to you." I froze, my grip tightening slightly on my glass. "I never meant to make you feel like you were only valuable when you were helping," she continued. "But I see now that I did, and I'm sorry." My chest tightened. I had imagined this moment before, played it out in my head in so many different ways, but I had never thought it would actually happen. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to meet her gaze. "Thank you," I said quietly. "That means a lot." Diane gave a small nod before glancing at Kevin. He shifted uncomfortably before muttering, "Yeah, I was kind of a jerk too." I smirked. "Kind of?" Kevin rolled his eyes but smirked back. "Okay, maybe more than kind of." A small laugh broke through the tension, and for the first time in a long time, I felt something I hadn't felt with my family in years, genuine warmth. The rest of the evening passed without tension, without passive-aggressive remarks or unspoken expectations. When dinner ended, I didn't rush to clear the plates. I didn't stack the dishes or wipe the counters. I simply sat, enjoying the conversation, enjoying the moment. As the night wrapped up, my mother walked me to the door. She hesitated, looking down for a second before meeting my eyes. "I meant what I said earlier." "I know," I said. She took a breath. "I hope you'll come back. Not just for dinners. Just whenever you want." I studied her face, searching for any hint of manipulation, any lingering expectation. But for the first time, I saw something different, something real. I gave a small smile. "I'll think about it." And this time, I meant it. As I drove home, the city lights stretched out before me, the cool night air brushing against my skin. I had walked into that house not as a helper, but as an equal. And for the first time, my family had no choice but to respect that. They had finally learned that I wasn't there to serve them. I wasn't there to be overlooked, expected, or taken for granted. I was there because I chose to be. And that made all the difference. I finally put myself first, and for the first time, they had to figure it out without me. But did they truly learn their lesson, or is this just a temporary truce? What would you do if your family only valued you when you were useful? Comment below. I want to hear your stories. And if you've ever had to teach someone your worth, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more powerful stories like this. For years, I thought saying yes made me a good daughter, a good person. But I learned the hard way, if you don't set boundaries, people will never stop taking. In America, independence is valued, yet too often we let obligation trap us. Family should be about mutual respect, not blind sacrifice. If your worth is only recognized when you're serving others, it's time to step back. Saying no isn't selfish, it's survival. I chose myself, and the world didn't fall apart. If anything, it finally fell into place. So ask yourself, are you living for others or for you?